Okay, I think we'll, excuse me, I think we'll have a crack at kicking off. Thank you for all attending again today. I'm sure there'll be more. I can already see more starting to come in, but obviously there's a timeliness to this, so we'll get started without further ado. So welcome to our fourth in the series of webinars. So we looked last week at how do we lead ourselves relationally through these trying times. And this week we are really looking forward to listening to Matthew talk us through how do we lead others through this. So it's so just skipping through to maybe not quite skipping through yet. A refresher on what We Are Company is about is I think we have a passion that the normal metrics where businesses are measured don't suffice anymore. Maybe they've gone down a certain financial route, especially. But really, we need to start looking at much broader set of metrics, social, environment, but also, obviously, importantly, relational. So the word company is all about getting that community and bringing that together. And we're really looking to pursue that further with this information. We've slightly, hopefully, taken on board your feedback. The next two webinars are going to slightly change. So in getting where we've got to, we feel, and the feedback has been, we've given a lot of content and a lot of food for thought, which leaves some rather obvious so what questions. So in the final two webinars, we're going to start to look at practical ways of actually implementing relational thinking, and then have more of a workshop-y type discussion on what you could do to get started along that journey. So we look forward to those, and hopefully they will be pertinent and relevant to bring together lots of this good thinking. I'd like to encourage you to use the chat functionality, adding comments and questions as we go through. But that's enough from me, and I will now hand over to Matthew, who will take you through today's presentation. Matthew.
Great, thanks, Andrew. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining. So I'm going to move quite quickly because there's a lot of content to cover when we're focusing on relationships. So our goal is in this session to introduce a sort of framework for thinking about relationships and how we can get more intentional, analyze them, review them, and so on. And then to think, how do we actually set about strengthening relationships during this time of remote working and isolation? And I'm going to throw out lots of tools and ideas. Remember, this whole webinar is recorded, so if you can't capture it or there's something you want to go back to, you'll find it all on our website. So first, a quick introduction, really just a reminder. A few years ago, this is one of the top 10 most watched TED Talks of all time. If you haven't watched it, strongly encourage you to go and have a look. It's only about 15 minutes long, given by psychiatrist Robert Waldinger. He directs an HBR study that's been going on for over 80 years, trying to figure out what drives human happiness. They've looked at sort of 724 people and tracked them over 80 years. Now they're continuing to track 2,000 of their children. And he's the fourth director of this program. And in this TED Talk, he summarizes what they found out about happiness. Essentially what they said was, and that's the quote, "Good relationships keep us healthier and happier and lead to longer life, period." And he particularly underscores the quality of relationships that matters the most. So in case we weren't convinced already, that's another bit of evidence to throw at you. As Andrew said, Simon spoke about self-awareness last week as foundational to relationships. I'm not going to talk anymore on that, but again, it's incredibly foundational to fruitful relationships, which is why we started there last week. During the course of the webinars over the last few weeks, it's been interesting how many people have been mentioning how actually this crisis has almost brought our attention back to relationships. One person said, I think in the first seminar, for us, like hand washing, it has revealed that we didn't do enough people connection before. Our managers are feeling a new burden, and yet it shouldn't have taken a crisis to find this out. So this crisis is also not only an opportunity to go back and sort of really ask questions about who we are, self-leadership, and what we're really on, what we are personally passionate. It's also an opportunity to, if you like, reset relationships, to get back to what this is really all about. I'd like to introduce to you to just the framework that we've started using and developing at We Are Company. And just to give you a bit of a framework, which then will shape how I approach this question of strengthening relationships for the rest of the webinar. Before I do that, let me just ask you just for 30 seconds, just to reflect on this question, these questions. How good are your relationships at work, in your workplace? How do you know? And what indicators do you use to help you get a sense of whether they are good or not? I'm just going to give you 30 seconds of silence just to reflect on that. And do feel free to share any thoughts or insights in the Zoom chat. Okay, so this is how we think, we've been thinking about it at We Are Company. So firstly, there's this issue of, Andrew mentioned this in the opening seminar, that we tend to give almost all of our attention in terms of measurement on financial capital, financial matters. And what we measure is what we give attention to. There's growing realization that really there are a whole bunch of other capitals that we really ought to be giving more time to. So there's human capital, environmental capital, and social and relational capital. And the awareness of this has been growing rapidly. Here are just two movements to give an example. The People Planet Profit movement under the banner of the economics of mutuality is highlighting exactly this point. There are 4 capitals, 3 capitals, we need to measure them all. The B Corporation movement, the Benefit Corporation movement are also doing exactly the same, saying we need to measure return on capital, not just financial capital, but also human, environmental, and social relational capital. But we really don't know how to do that. How do you actually measure return on social relational capital? Well, that's what we're really trying to get our minds around and help others do at We Are Company. So the way we think about it is that we need to think about relationships at 3 levels. Firstly, we need to explore what are the foundations of great relationships. That's why we started last week with Simon on self-awareness and self-regulation. And I'm about to, immediately after this section, I'm going to be talking to you about social awareness, not just self-awareness, but also social awareness or empathy. So there's the foundations of great relationships we need to give attention to. Secondly, we need to give attention to the context for great relationships. Here we draw on the relational proximity framework, which we introduced, I think, in the first and second sessions. 5 relational areas, 5 contextual areas we really need to think about if we want to see relationships thrive. And finally, we look at the marks of great relationship. And here we draw on Lencioni's framework of 5 dysfunctions of team, 5 behaviors, things that you will see in teams that are performing brilliantly, where relationships are thriving. And what we're trying to do is take that framework and use a variety of questionnaire techniques, very similar to employee engagement or customer satisfaction or beneficiary feedback approaches, to ask people questions in a particular team about these different aspects. And then what we do is we generate a series of insights, of charts, which we throw back, analysis, which we throw back at teams to drive insight and conversation and to figure out how we can improve. Now, this is something I think we will focus on more in the next session when we begin to think about how do we make this real. But just to give you a flavor of the kind of things that we're doing, here are 6 charts that describe relational effectiveness. So imagine any team. It could be your team, a project team. It could be a board, a leadership team. And within this, we would ask the team members a series of questions that allow us then to generate these insights about the effectiveness of the team. Well, the first chart looks at trust levels overall from each team member's perspectives and compares it against a benchmark. The second chart looks at those 5 areas of relational proximity under context and gets the whole team members' perspectives on how are we doing in these areas, as well as looking at outliers. The third chart looks at the emotional intelligence of the team. So the whole team looks at each other and says, well, look, how good are we at social awareness and self-awareness? And again, we compare that to benchmarks. The fourth looks at emotional intelligence. On the one hand, that foundational component, On the vertical axis and on the horizontal axis, we looked at the contextual factors of relationship. And we plot where everybody believes the team is, as well as an average. And so in this instance, we see there's a few team members, the 3 red dots in the bottom left, who are essentially struggling with social and self-awareness and struggling with relational proximity. Top right corner, there's a bunch of people who are high empaths, highly self-aware, but also really aware of the context they're in and how do we make the context work for great relationships. And there's a sole red dot on the top left-hand corner where this individual, they are socially aware, they're high emotional intelligence, but for some reason, the context they're in is meaning they're struggling to enable their relationships to thrive. Relational proximity is low for them. A fifth chart we're looking at is looking at the overall level of challenge in a team on the vertical axis and the overall level of cohesion on the horizontal axis. And here we can map where individual team members think the team overall is. And as you can see in this particular team, we are in a place where there is not a lot of challenge, largely, a lot of in that bottom right quadrant, not a lot of challenge, but high cohesion. And this is typically where we end up with groupthink. Again, where we're not really surfacing the issues, we all think we're wonderful and we're not really performing. And the final chart that we look at is marks of team effectiveness. This is taking Lencioni's framework, and we look at these indicators and get the team to reflect on the marks. So to what extent is our team exhibiting these behaviors? So in this particular team, what we see is there's high trust. So there's high social awareness, high empathy going on, but there's no conflict. There's no healthy conflict. And as a result, because there's no conflict, that doesn't lead to mutual commitment. It doesn't lead to a sense of mutual accountability. Because you're not doing those things, we're not getting results. So again, that just to give you a flavor of the way we're beginning to use data and insight to drive conversations that help teams improve. So in the 3 areas we've looked at, I've only got time, I'm afraid, to pick a few areas and give you a few thoughts on each. So I'm going to look at social awareness and empathy under foundations. I'm going to look at encounter under context, and I'm going to look at healthy conflict under marks of great relationships. So let's start with increasing empathy. So I'm going to hand back to Simon, and we're going to do a little poll. Okay, so a few questions for you. Is empathy primarily a trait that we're born with, or primarily a skill that we can develop? So a trait that we're born with primarily, or a skill that we can develop primarily?
Just another 5 seconds for you to complete that. Most of you have done it, so here we go. And we'll share those results now with you.
So interesting. So I think we on general feel that skill is primarily something we can develop. I think that's what more of you said. We'll come back to that in just a moment. So 2 case studies I quickly want to touch on. So in 2012, Google embarked on an initiative codenamed Project Aristotle, a very Googleian name. And they studied hundreds of Google's teams, and really what they're trying to figure out is why some stumbled and what was it that enabled Google teams to thrive. And they hunted and hunted, and for a long time they couldn't find any correlator. They couldn't find any 1 or 2 things that predicted highly effective, high team effectiveness. But eventually, when they took a slightly different tack, they stumbled across 2 behaviors. Firstly, on the good teams, members spoke in roughly the same proportion, a phenomenon the researchers referred to as equality and distribution of conversation turn-taking, a bit of a mouthful. But the second thing they observed was that all the good teams, all the strong teams, had a high average social sensitivity. They seemed to know when someone was feeling upset or left out. They had this, they were empathetic, essentially. CIA, another interesting case study. After the tragic events of 9/11, a team of Harvard psychologists quietly invaded the US intelligence system. The team wanted to determine again what makes intelligence units effective. What they eventually discovered the single strongest predictor in that group effectiveness, beyond everything else, beyond team membership, beyond having a clear plan, beyond communication, beyond rewards, recognition, anything else, the single greatest predictor was the amount of help that analysts gave to each other, underpinned again by an empathetic sense of when people were in need. So what do we know about empathy? Well, we know a dictionary definition, for example. I think we all have a gut sense of what empathy is. This is taken from, I can't remember which online dictionary, the ability to understand and share the feelings of others. But it's also something neuroscience says we are wired for. In the last 25 years, neuroscientists have discovered that we're all born with mirror neurons, which program us to care vicariously about the experiences of other people around us. That's a scenario we've probably all experienced when so somebody stubs their toe or cuts their finger or falls off a bike, and then we wince, just like Boris and David are here. I have no idea what they're wincing at. That wincing, that unconscious reaction is caused by mirror neurons firing in our brains. Statistics. We know that empathy is declining. This is a US research that says empathy levels have declined by almost 50% in the last 40 years. Interestingly, and the most severe decline in the last 10, whilst at the same time, internet searches on empathy have apparently doubled also in the last 10 years. So it's something we know we need, but we don't know how to cultivate it. And then there's this question of nature and nurture, which the poll pointed to. Is it nurture or nature? Are we like Data in Star Trek, where all we can do is, it's just impossible. We're not born with it, we can't do it. Or we like the sort of off the scale empath Diana Troy. I think the reality, as the poll results suggest, I think we all know it is both. It's an aspect of both. It can be cultivated. And I think my message above all today is that it can be cultivated in this crisis. In fact, it's a golden opportunity to learn how to do this better. So empathy, I'm going to leave the quotes. I'm going to move straight on to empathy, 3 differing forms. When people talk about empathy, they usually think, they like to sort of disaggregate it to recognize the 3 kind of almost different dimensions or forms of empathy. The first is a cognitive empathy. It's an intellectual understanding of being aware of the other person. It's engaging the mind to think what's really going on here. Emotional empathy is that stepping into people's shoes. It's really sharing the feelings with those people. It's much more of an emotional response as opposed to a cognitive response. And compassionate empathy is the idea that actually, real empathy involves taking action. You do something with that cognitive and emotional empathy. It involves taking action to support other people in response to what we're feeling and sensing and thinking. So I'm going to quickly run through 5 ideas of how we might cultivate empathy. And against each of these, I really want to underscore that I think these are all things we can do right now. We don't need to wait until the crisis has ended. So the first one, this is the human library. And the core idea is cultivate curiosity about others. Do it intentionally, be interested in other people. This is the human library. This is an initiative where it really is a human library in the truest sense of the word. They host events where readers can borrow real human beings who serve as open books and have conversations with them about topics they wouldn't normally have access to. Each human book on the human bookshelf represents a group in our society that is marginalized or subjected to prejudice, stigmatization, or whatever. Now, so a couple of lovely strap lines. The first is don't judge a book by its cover. And the second one is unjudge someone today. Let's unjudge someone today. Also in this theme is expand your circle of empathy. Cultivate curiosity about people who are not like you, people not your usual suspects. Make a choice to do it. It's a brilliant way to cultivate empathy. Ask yourself, how would I feel if I were in somebody else's shoes? Make a conscious point, maybe even before a phone call when you're chatting to somebody. What is it like being in that person's shoes at this time? You choose to think the best of people, non-judgmental, appreciate people as human beings when you engage with them. You suspend that judgment, that tendency to judge people, choose to think the best of other people. And there's a lot of neuroscience that supports the power of doing that in relationships. You call people up. I mean, it's a bit of a no-brainer, but actually, we're all desperate for communication. Now's a great time to do that. And the last bit I just want to idea is, don't read all the questions, but I love collecting great questions to ask people. And actually, when you start looking online, people have done all the hard work for you. There's loads of great questions to ask people. Some of the ones I love are, when do you feel truly alive? Or what gives your life meaning? What was the best thing that happened to you last week? A great question to be asking at the moment. Turning points in your life. And even a new one I've discovered is, what question do you ask to find out the most about a person? So ask great questions, cultivate questions. Second area is, be more present to other people. There was a time, I think when I was at Tear Fund, and I actually made it a practice to always stop and speak to homeless people. I'd stop and ask their name and share my name, and I'd hear a little bit about their story before moving on. Unfortunately, I have not been good at that. I always seem to be too busy at the moment, but I learned so much when I did that. It was so insightful, so life-giving for me. There's something about practicing slowing down that is so important here. The reason I'm not doing it today is because I'm always too busy. And that's why one of my main practice at the moment in terms of a discipline is to slow down. I try and spend 20 minutes every morning just in silence, where I just try and come alive to all of my senses in the present moment. There's something about giving our full attention in empathy and being very wary of distractions. And it's really important to really focus 100% on the people. And I'm really bad at that, especially on Zoom. My mind tends to wander. I get distracted by other things, even on the computer in a conversation. I need to stop myself doing that. Pause before a conversation or a phone call. You just create a little bit of space before you engage with people. And then maybe just ask again, what is it like to be whoever it is you're speaking to at this time, in this moment? Take a breath. Just pause for a moment. You obviously use video. And maybe remember that the greatest gift we can give each other, and a number of people have said this, I can't remember who this quote comes from, the greatest gift we can give is the purity of our attention. It's a gift. Practice active listening. This is from Stephen Covey's 8th Habit. And it's basically saying, look, become aware of how we're listening. Are we actually ignoring, or are we pretending to listen and waiting to speak, selectively listening, waiting to disagree, attentive listening, or are we actually empathetically listening with the other person's frame of reference in mind? Those first 4 are already from our own perspective. So something about be wary. Where are you on this ladder? I know most of the time I'm in those middle 3. Occasionally I break through into that final level. As we're thinking about practicing active listening, it's really helpful, I think, to think in terms of different perspectives. So deliberately think, okay, in this relationship, how do I see and feel and hear the situation? Then put yourself in the shoes of others, of the person you're speaking to. How do they see, hear, feel the situation? Then also step back and think, would an external observer see, hear, feel this conversation and this situation? Again, deliberately choosing to step into that is very powerful. When I joined Tear Fund, I was given one top tip, which I then shared with everybody I spoke to, which was, as a leader, listen more and talk less. It's such a powerful piece of advice for leaders. What else can we do in active listening? I think it's vital to remember tone of voice and body language. In the 1970s, Albert Mehrabian did this bit of research where he came up with these famous statistics that say 55% is body language and communication, 38% is tone, and only 7% is the message, the actual words we're trying to get across. And that's really worth remembering at this time. How do we really become aware of body language and tone of voice, especially when it's harder to maybe connect and see some of these things? The power of reflecting and summarizing back is so amazing. You know, when you've had a conversation with somebody, demonstrate you've listened by reflecting what you've heard back to them, and ask for them to say, is that right? Until you've got it right. Learn to ask better questions. The power of a good open-ended question is phenomenal. And get feedback from trusted people, family. And we've got, we're all practicing feedback on this kind of stuff around the living room table. There's 7 of us in isolation at the moment. And there's lots of opportunity to practice these skills and get feedback. So active listening. Another way to increase empathy is to think like a coach. Again, I haven't got time to go through this, but this model, the GROW model, hopefully many of you are familiar with, it is a fabulous model just for using in any conversation. And it helps you turn a little bit beyond the empathetic and the cognitive response to, the emotional and cognitive empathetic response to actually the compassionate response that sees action. This model was developed by John Whitmore, who's seen by many as sort of the father of the whole coaching sector. So learn about the GROW model. It's easy to find online. It's a fantastic model. Finally, I think this is really important. Empathy is a two-way street. So as we're maybe giving empathy, be willing to receive empathy too, especially if you're in any kind of leadership role. I would say this is probably my single biggest leadership lesson over the last 15, 20 years, is that being vulnerable actually increases my effectiveness as a leader. Being open about our uncertainties and frustrations and anxieties and challenges on the home front, and discovering that as I do that, it creates and invites others into a space where they then feel it's safe to be more open and transparent themselves. Incredibly powerful. I love, so another top 10 talk on TED. If you've not seen it, I highly recommend it, by Brené Brown. She gave a talk on the power of vulnerability. And I love these 2 quotes. Vulnerability is not weakness. That myth is profoundly dangerous. Vulnerability is about the willingness to show up and be seen when you can't control the outcome. It is our greatest measure of courage. Vulnerability is the birthplace of innovation, of creativity, and change. So I guess before moving on, my question to you is, what is your, and where is your empathy gym? How are you working out in your own empathy, cultivating this skill? So a brief sort of 30-second pause. What questions do you have about empathy, about its role in relationships, about how to increase empathy in yourself and in others? Just have 30 seconds to think. And again, if there's any particular questions you'd love us to have a bit of a chew over later on, stick it in the chat function. That would be really helpful and will help guide our Q&A session later. So just 30 seconds on that. Okay, I'm going to move on to increasing encounter now. So just a reminder, encounter is all about communication and how the directness of our communication either helps build relationships and reinforce understanding, or actually undermines it. A few years ago, when I was younger, in my 20s, I sailed in the Greek islands. And we were sailing in this sort of wonderful open sea. We could see as far as in any direction, as far as the eye could see. And then we had to cross from the Saronic Gulf to the west of Greece through what's called the Corinthian Canal. And you can see it on the top left of the map. And this is what it looks like. You suddenly get to this place where everything comes down. You're these walls and you can't see anything anymore except this narrow gully. All the rules change of sailing. You're on motor, everything changes. There's this narrowing of the bandwidth. And for me, this is the image. This is the way it feels to me, going from what I'm used to communicating by Zoom. It's a narrowing of the bandwidth. So there are all sorts of challenges that are thrown up. I'm just going to quickly throw out some of them just for you to be thinking about. Visual and non-verbal cues. It's harder to read people. You can't see my expressive hands all over the place. There's a lot of the unconscious subliminal information that we take for granted that help us make sense of what's going on in the office environment. You can just sense the mood in the room, the atmosphere, usually. You can't do that if you're going down this narrow, tunnel-visioned Corinthian canal of the world of Zoom and email. There are fewer informal opportunities for knowledge exchange where we just bump into people and chat about something. We've lost the opportunity to physical contact, of embracing people, of hugs, of just putting your hand on somebody's shoulder and being with them. The use of physical space is compromised. I'm used to throwing up post-it notes on the walls and using flip charts and throwing things on the table. We can't do that anymore. It's quite difficult on Zoom. We'll get to, there's some good things about Zoom I'll come to in a moment. It's hard, there's some evidence saying that people are finding it harder to get points across. I can't wave my hands around, I can't walk around the room, I can't raise my voice, I can't, all of those aspects that help us to get our point across. Well, you can't do it anymore, it's harder. There's less spontaneity and serendipity, and that's often the source of creativity, where you bump into somebody, or you suddenly see something, or something just sparks in your mind in the office environment and with relationships. And arguably, creativity can become harder because, especially when it's that creativity resulting from us working together. There's a new phrase, a horrible one, that I've seen floating around the newspapers called Zoom exhaustion, where we're all just finding it really tiring being on Zoom the whole time. Thank you for joining today. And for many, this narrow channel of Zoom is it's constraining. It feels unfamiliar, and the rules of communication, we don't really know how things work here yet. There are opportunities too. So this is on the left is a Zoom call I was on yesterday, and on the right is an image from Microsoft Teams. We've got some great technology, and there's some benefits of that too. Just a few of them to throw out. The added functionality of Zoom. There's some great things. We've been using the polling thing. Yesterday we used breakout rooms, and actually I love the breakout rooms in chat because in Zoom, because when you break out, it's for a time limited period. Everybody starts talking straight away, and when they stop, they all join again. And so there's a focus to it. And actually, I've found the ones I've been involved in have been incredibly fruitful. You can see people's faces. Actually, there's some evidence that people are saying, especially when you're in sort of more lecturer-teacher mode, actually people are finding Zoom is better than the classroom because you can see people clearly. You can see reactions much more clearly than you are when you're distant. There's all sorts of people who are finding, who are really resistant to digital technology. My parents, some people in our church community, college professors who insist all teaching must be done face-to-face. And actually they're having to do it now. And what they're discovering, it's not as bad as they thought. There's something about the equity of voice and presence when you're online. There's something about the volume is being told of those loud people, the expressive, expansive people. We're turning their volume down, and all the people are generally a bit quieter. Their volume is turning up, and that's actually, so there's almost an equity of presence that is beginning to be encouraged through these channels. We have more space and stillness. So when we prepare for meetings, we're often in a different environment, a stiller environment. Then when we engage, we've often thought things through a little bit more clearly, maybe a little bit more creatively. Crisis is, of course, highlighting the importance of communication and our value in it. So in many ways, it's an opportunity we're discovering. We've got to get this right. We've been paying lip service to it. So some benefits too, and a few ideas on how we might increase the quality and bandwidth of our communication. So firstly, focus on, again, some of these you will know, I'm just going to run through them very briefly. Focus on clarity regarding goals, agreements, decisions, plans. That's one thing everybody's saying. You've got to be really, really clear on these things. You can't take things for granted. Go overboard in terms of clarifying goals, agreements, so on. Secondly, create a rhythm, a cadence to the meetings and to the structure of meetings. So have a clear start, a middle, and an end. Signal the agenda clearly. Make it very clear when we're making decisions. Think about different kinds of meetings. So a couple of organizations I'm working with have introduced a coffee breaks in the morning where people come together just for social engagement, not for work. And they do something else later in the year, sort of after drinks gathering. So again, find ways to create structure and rhythm, create moments where we all come together, where people have been introducing a celebration of birthdays in organizations, where we just come together for 10 minutes and celebrate an individual. Everybody comes together and celebrates that individual. Lots of different ways we can do it to create those opportunities. In general, everybody's saying we need shorter meetings with increased frequency. You can't stay on Zoom for 5-hour non-stop meetings. Shorter meetings, increased frequency. Within the constraints and confines of Zoom, relaxed style, create as much freedom, as much space, as much spaciousness as possible. Relax the rules as much as you can. When things go wrong, laugh. Don't take it too seriously. Inject fun and humor, laugh. Within those constraints, have as much freedom, as much flexibility as possible. And that's one thing I'm hearing lots of people say is we've got to chill out a bit because yes, we do have to get tighter. That channel is clear, but within the confines of it, let's be as relaxed and generous as we possibly can. Mine hard for disagreements and differing viewpoints. You're more asking questions, checking in, checking out, finding out what's really going on. If you spot something, if you see something, assume that there are differing perspectives. Mine harder for those viewpoints because they're harder to get across, harder to read. Obviously, increase active listening skills. I've spoken about that, especially the summarizing and reflecting. Use the functionality, for goodness sake. It's fantastic, some of it, but do it together. So there's almost like kind of an agreement where the three of us, if we're working together, let's all use it well. And increase the space for emotions. That's the one thing that's really being cut out in this narrowing of bandwidth. And I just want to highlight 2 quick ideas to take away that I found incredibly useful over the years for increasing space for the expression of emotions. The first is a check-in. So again, in all my coaching, I always start coaching sessions by asking who I'm speaking to reflect, just to share 3 questions that describe how they're feeling about their role and work at this time. And it's fascinating what comes out. And often we spend the whole time talking about just that. Other people we know are just doing a very simple poll, even using the poll functionality on Zoom to say, how are you feeling right now? 1 out of 10. Or at the end of meeting, do a concerns and benefits where you ask quickly people to check in and say, what concerns and what benefits do they have coming out of this meeting? There's also something called the team barometer that I was sheep dipped in at McKinsey. It's pretty much the first thing we learned how to do, along with giving and receiving feedback, more of that in a moment, which is basically as a team figuring out what does relational fruitfulness and effectiveness look like for us, come up with a series of statements that capture it, and every couple of weeks do a poll and see how you're doing, discuss the results, especially the lows and highs, and do something about it, and do it regularly. So I'm going to leave this because I'm slightly short of time, but do give some time to thinking about the questions you have about how we increase counter. Again, if there are any questions you particularly want us to answer, add it to the Zoom chat, please. Finally, I want to touch on managing conflict. I just want to quickly go back to Simon for another poll. And with Simon, I'm assuming all of these questions will appear in the poll when I hand back to you. Is that correct?
That's right, yeah.
Okay, great. So the question is, what is the primary reason we fail to tackle conflict in workplaces in fruitful, constructive ways? So just select one. Simon, do I need to hand back to you or are you okay?
No, it's fine. Yeah,
great.
It's launched.
Okay, shall we stop there?
Yeah, we'll end the poll now.
Great, fascinating. So top answer, we avoid conflict and fail to tackle the issue for too long. So let me quickly give you a few thoughts on conflict. And again, this is going to be fairly brief because I want to make sure we've got some time for questions and answers at the end. Very briefly, the new CEO of Microsoft, well, relatively new, Satya Nadella, basically pointed out that when he had joined Microsoft, the culture was conflict heavy, and it really had been for years, and Microsoft was known for that. And he got everybody to read this book called Nonviolent Communication, which is a brilliant read if you've not read it. And really the heart of this is a nonviolent approach to communication around the 4 key steps on the right. It is about observing what's going on in a conflict or a relationship. It is about highlighting your own feelings and your reactions to whatever you're observing. It's then highlighting the underlying need that is leading me to feel that way. And then it is then requesting of the other person something that helps you then meet that need. And it's doing that together. But what's so interesting was the culture has changed radically in Microsoft in only a handful of years. There's so much so now that it is one of the most creative and collaborative cultures, having shifted radically away from this conflict heavy and cutthroat culture. And Nadella points it down to this book, really at the heart of it. Very briefly, you may be familiar with this already, the Thomas Kilmann model, but this is basically a model that challenges us to be thoughtful and mindful about the kind of conflict we're in and our approach to taking it, really by reflecting on the degree to which I am asserting my own possession or not, and the degree to which I am cooperating, but cooperativeness, the degree to which I'm focusing on others. It's very helpful because it gets us just to think, where we really want to be is in the top right, where we're collaborating, and where we don't want to be is down in the bottom left, avoiding. And it's just what you all said in your response to that poll. That's often where we end up. We withdraw, we avoid, we duck the issue. So let's explore a bit more how we can do that. I find this model, just a couple of models just to throw out there, just to get you to go away and look at. The interest-based relational approach, basically these are 6 simple rules to apply in any conflict or semi-conflict. It's basically remember relationships are the first priority. Actually, you want to leave this conflict with relationships being better than they were before. See it as an opportunity. You've got to keep people and problems separate. Pay attention to the interests that are being expressed, the deeper needs. Listen first, talk less, that classic focus on listening, focus on facts, and again, think about options together. As I mentioned earlier, the other thing I was sheep dipped in at McKinsey, pretty much the first thing I learned was how to give and receive feedback to other people, because McKinsey recognized the importance of giving and receiving feedback, to surfacing issues early and doing conflict in creative, constructive ways. And this again picks up very much on nonviolent communication techniques. But again, it asks me, when I'm giving feedback to other people, to focus on facts, number one, to talk about how I feel about the situation, to listen and explore, and then to think about what concretely can we do differently. So 10 quick suggestions for what we can do to manage conflict well in this particular environment we find ourselves in now. So firstly, don't use the inability to meet in person as an excuse. Well, we've got to do this face to face, so we're just going to have to wait until the end of the crisis. I don't think that's going to cut it. And indeed, there are loads of organizations that have had to do this. So I worked with Relief Agency, with MedAir and Tier Fund in crisis zones, where again, it's very similar, crisis response. People are remote, you have to tackle conflict and learn how to do it. Remember, as you deal with conflict, especially in the current area, it's good. Conflict is not something to be avoided. It is all about managing it in ways that are fruitful. That's what we're trying to do here, is make conflict become a healthy and a fruitful thing that drives, that is generative, that actually strengthens relationships. There's a lot of research that's been done about the classic common issues that tend to stimulate conflict in remote teams. So here are 4: misaligned goals and priorities, expectations, feeling that one or more employees aren't pulling their weight on a team, miscommunication or complete lack of communication, and not knowing one's place in a team. So attend to those issues. Establish a rhythm of team engagement opportunities. I touched on that earlier, about creating structure, regular, where people know they're going to engage with other people, with the whole organization, and do it more frequently and for shorter periods. Mind for emotions, dissenting voices, differences. As soon as you sense something, don't think, oh, it's going to be fine. Deal with it, tackle with it. Assume positive intent. Again, choose to think the best of people, especially given what everybody's wrestling with at the moment. Use that feedback model that I mentioned extensively and resolve conflict early, because then you head it off before it becomes a big issue. Prepare well, listen well, and if things get heated, take a pause, step back. And most organizations are saying they've deliberately been preparing very intentional conflict resolution approaches whilst remote working, is thinking ahead how to do this. So those are 10 thoughts on what to do. So we've looked at 3 aspects. We've looked at empathy, how we can increase empathy. We've looked at encounter and communication, how we can strengthen that in this time. We've looked at healthy communication. I want to leave you with a couple of quotes from 2 friends who lead organizational development in national charities, which I think are just a great place to finish. Firstly, Olivia says, we have to give the highest priority to building healthy, resilient working relationships. The ways that we build relationships haven't fundamentally changed. What has changed is that we now need far more intentional way, because it's all about intent. That's what she's underscoring, and focus. Ellie says, we've learned that an individualistic approach is essential in this crisis. The variance of emotional reaction can change by the hour for people. Seeking to understand each other better and beginning every interaction with a simple "how are you" has proved highly beneficial. This has built trust and relationships. Right, I'm going to hand back now to Simon. I'll just over to Simon, just where we go.
Brilliant. Matthew, thank you so much, and so much rich content to engage with there. And thank you for all of you who've been engaging on the chat as well with some questions. We've got some great questions. And as Matthew just takes a little breather there, the first question I'd like to pose, Matthew, came from Jenny. And Jenny was asking, can you be over empathetic and so miss saying difficult things? So can you overdo the empathy? And where's that tension between empathy and healthy conflict?
It's a great question. And I think I would take you back to the 3 different forms of empathy: the cognitive, the emotional, and the compassionate. I think that is actually, a book has been written about it, when we get stuck on the empathy, and that's all we do. And that's exactly what happens, Jenny. You're absolutely right. We get stuck and we can't break out of just feeling with somebody. And because we're feeling so close to them, we stop engaging our mind and we stop shifting to the compassionate response. So I think holding the 3 in tension is the way to go.
Brilliant, that's excellent. And then a second question from Colette this time. So, and maybe Andrew, you can weigh in on this one. So does the Lencioni model suggest that you can only achieve results if there is healthy conflict? He has a pyramid, obviously, that starts with trust and then conflict and then goes to attention to results. So can you only achieve results if there's healthy conflict? Andrew, maybe you'd like to jump in on that one.
Yeah, so my interpretation of that, so please, I do forgive Lencioni if it's a misinterpretation, is you do need healthy conflict. I think underlying it is the issue of using the word conflict. Using the word conflict gives immediate negative connotations. Whereas if you think of it, how do we have healthy discourse, which might lead to an outcome that wasn't my preferred an outcome coming into this, which is obviously a little bit long-winded, but I think that's a much better way of looking at it. So personally, I would say you need healthy conflict. The issue is emotionally, the word conflict can be negative and challenging.
Matthew, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, a couple of points. So I think the whole point of having a team, and one of the beauties of teams, is you bring contrasting viewpoints. And so the whole thing is, how do you get those contrasting viewpoints out? And it is through the medium of debate, conversation. Yeah, again, maybe Andrew's point is the conflict it has all sorts of connotations with it. But I think the foundation of Lencioni is trust and vulnerability. In my experience of working on, I'd say, the Tier Fund leadership team, was we used to have intense, vigorous debates where people who were not in the team would come and watch us, And they would leave alarmed, thinking we were all at each other's throats. And we weren't actually. We were just having a heated debate. Because the level of trust was so high, we knew each other well enough to say, we know what's going on here. We're just getting passionate about what we're. And so trust, again, I would also want to underscore that. It's very difficult to do that without the underpinnings of trust and deep empathy in relationships as a foundation.
And my experience has been one that actually insecurity in individuals, that goes back to last week really, insecurity in individuals, a lack of self-awareness actually prevents them from building the trusting relationships and entering into conflict, which actually means the great ideas that they have that might be in tension with other ideas never get on the table, and so they never get debated. And so actually we have a paucity of decision making and a paucity of ideas that actually can generate better and better results for an organization. So brilliant. Colette, thank you for that question. As you can see, it stimulated a lot of discussion and debate there. Matthew, Ron says, how do you replicate the water cooler encounter when remote? Are there any emerging ideas? Just to come in on that for myself, my daughter's at home at the moment, and with my wife and I, we deliberately create water cooler moments at the moment, and they're kind of dragging me back and going, this is our water cooler moment. You just can't walk off and do more work. This is our water cooler moment. So, but how do you create that remotely, Matthew?
And so the two things I'm hearing lots of, quite a few people doing, let's say lots, quite a few people doing, is firstly having a sort of mid-morning slot or a mid-afternoon slot or an after-drink slot, which is diarized, where it's very explicit that this is to recreate that slot. So you turn up with your cup of coffee and you just chat about anything that is not work. And again, similarly in the afternoon and similarly after work. And the intention is to recreate that dynamic as much as is possible. The second way that people are doing that is very deliberately in meetings to start the first thing in every meeting is to start a question of just open conversation about for 5 minutes before we get into the detail. And neither of those are perfect, but both are saying they are helping to some degree. I guess the third thing is just encouraging one-on-one people just to get in touch. And when you, let's say if you're a leader or a manager, one of the things I'm hearing from 2 or 3 organizations I'm working with is they are literally saying every line manager needs to check in with their team every day, even if it's just for 5 minutes. And the purpose of that is not to necessarily talk about work, it's to find out how people are.
Brilliant. Andrew, do you want to add into that?
No,
how are you doing your water cooler moments?
I think those are all good points. The only thing I'd add is the most common question I get asked is, how do I think this relationships are going to play out when we are out of this isolation? And I think there is a part where we can create as close to the real life scenarios as has been articulated by Simon and Matthew. However, I do think that it has emphasized the need for face-to-face interaction and physical contact. And I think what's going to be fascinating is how are water cooler moments, using that phrase, of higher quality after this and are more purposeful and helpful to each other. I'm not talking about task-driven, I'm talking about more conscious of each other's time, more conscious of each other's mood and working with each other more. So I think that there's ways of trying to create it, but I'd also caveat with is we are going to move out of this and being purposeful in our relationships and in physical contact in relationships will come to the fore a lot.
Okay, I've left the most difficult question for last, Matthew, okay, as we're just running out of time. So here goes. And that's basically, is there any evidence that increased empathy leads to increased performance? Or actually, can you overdo empathy and performance dips?
So I have seen research that suggests increasing empathy does increase in performance. And I've given you quite a few case studies, just touched on a few examples. So I'll probably come back to Microsoft as one example. But I think there is now evidence that says, again, but the problem is, of course, how do you measure empathy? It's a difficult thing to get to the bottom of. I think I would say it comes back to what I said earlier, is it all depends by what we mean by that term, and getting more clear that this is not just simply an emotional stepping into shoes and that's it. It is actually this thoughtful, cognitive desire to understand what's going on in the minds of other people, to step into their shoes, not simply to feel with them, but to do something fruitful that comes out of it. And to be honest, as soon as we believe that relationships are important, or organizations are important, or going back even to the word company, that actually this is all about the quality of interaction is what makes relationships fruitful. And if we believe empathy is a core aspect of enabling relationships to thrive, I think it's true that better empathy will and does lead to improved performance, full stop.
Brilliant. Well, thanks very much, everyone, for joining our 4th webinar. The next one is in 2 weeks' time, on the 14th. We thought not have one next Thursday because it's just before the bank holiday. Thank you so much, Matthew, for such an engaging presentation. There will be a recording of this webinar up this evening on the website and on the YouTube channel, so do please share it around. Next time, we'll be thinking about how do we start measuring relationships and the quality of relationships in our organizations and creating a relational culture within our organizations. So 2 weeks' time, hope you can join us. You'll get a link to register for the next webinar this evening as well, with a link to the recording. So Matthew, thanks so much once again, and thanks everyone for joining us today and for all your great questions.